if you don't have those volunteers to make sure that the vaccine or the treatment works, then you're going to be experimented on when you're sick, no matter what the disease is. So I say we let people volunteer.
That is President Walter Kimbrough, president of Dillard University in New Orleans. He is our guest today on this episode of the Louisiana NOW podcast. Welcome in, everyone. I am your host, Todd Rossnagel. It is great to have you along with us. So glad you have found our podcast. If this is your first time listening, welcome. If you're a subscriber, thank you. Dillard University is a historically black university in New Orleans and has consistently been ranked by various publications as one of the top 10 HBCUs in America. They are a United Methodist Church affiliated campus, and by the way, what a campus it is, recently named one of the top 50 most beautiful campuses in the entire country, right there in the Gentilly neighborhood. Dr. Walter Kimbrough is just the 7th president of Dillard, having arrived in New Orleans in 2012. He has been recognized for his research and writing on HBCUs and the role they play in America, and we're going to talk about that. He was also mentioned a few years ago as one of the top 20 college presidents that you should follow on social media. His handle, by the way, Hbcus. Recently, Dr. Kimbrough has been in the news for something completely unrelated to education, the pandemic. Dr. Kimbrough has agreed to take part in a vaccine trial for COVID-19. We're going to ask him about that, how it started, why he decided to do it, what it's like, and even the controversy that has come as a result of his choice to participate. We'll also discuss Dillard's new Center for Racial Justice and his hopes for meaningful change in the city of New Orleans and America. But first, we talked about the hurricane season and how New Orleans has, thankfully, avoided storms thus far in this busy hurricane season.
New Orleans knows how to deal with storms. This is my 9th hurricane season here. So I'm really confident in the governor and the mayor and how things are set up. So that makes it easy to deal with that uncertainty of a storm. But it is something that you have to wait. You can't just jump out there and say, I hear there's a hurricane. Let's just, shut down everything and run. It's like, no, you have to wait. You have to be patient. You have to watch it. You got to start looking at, what's happening with the upper winds? Is there wind shear? Is there dry air? And all of those things impact the storm. So once you start listening for that language, then you can start to really make a good prediction as to what's going to happen.
One of the things that I don't think we can predict, or at least we haven't been able to figure out how to predict right now, is the pandemic. And I wanted to switch maybe gears to the pandemic because one of the reasons why I wanted to reach out and have a conversation with you was the news of you agreeing to take part in a vaccine trial for COVID-19. And I suppose my first question to you, President Kimbrough, is why? Why did you feel called to do this?
Well, so I'm a cable news junkie, so I'm watching hours, basically when I get home and after I've, helped everybody have dinner and I work out, I'm spending 3-4 hours watching cable news. And you keep seeing all of these stories about, we have these vaccine trials, but there was sort of like this call to say, if we don't have a diversity of people participating, we don't know if the vaccine works. And so it's something I started to think about is, there are also the stories that the people who are dying the most from COVID-19 look like me. The deaths are overrepresented for African Americans. At one point during this summer, Louisiana, which is a state that's 33% black, had 70% of the deaths being black. Okay. It wasn't until recently when now black deaths are 48%. It's still we're one of the worst in terms of overrepresentation. So you got all these comorbidities that exist in these African American communities. So this virus is very deadly for us. And so, I was watching it one day and, my wife and I were talking. I was like, what, I think I want to, maybe be in a trial because they're asking people that they need people to participate. So I thought about it. I was like, maybe I should do that. There's nothing really else I can do. I'm not a scientist and, I'm not a frontline worker. I'm, blessed to have a job where I can work remotely. And, we were able to, shut down in the spring and send people home. And so my level of risk to really get it is minimal because I can protect myself to a degree. But there are a lot of people who look like me who have frontline jobs and they can't do it. So I was like, well, maybe I could do something. But then you go back to just sort of doing what you do. I mean, there wasn't an easy way for me to get involved. And so then, middle of August, the president of Xavier called me and he says, "Hey, I'm in this vaccine study. And maybe if we both get in it, then we could, let our campuses know, hey, we're in this. Is something that we hope people will think about doing." So that was my invitation in. I was like, you know what? It's made it too easy for me. So when he said that, I was like, yeah, get me connected. So the research team at Oxnard, it's the Pfizer study. They reached out to me, and by August the 25th, I was officially enrolled in the program. So it wasn't anything I was really worried about. My undergrad degree is in biology, so I have some basic rudimentary knowledge of how some of these things work. So that was never a concern for me. But it was just something to say, how can I help? Because people who look like me are dying the most from this disease. And what can I do to be helpful? And so if I can offer myself to make sure we have a vaccine that works, but it's safe, and particularly because the people who look like me need the safe vaccine the most, this is the least I could do. So that's how I got involved.
I have a lot of follow-up questions, but one of the most immediate questions from just hearing your story, I want to go back to your wife. What was her reaction to all of this?
Oh, she was fine. She was like, I'm not doing that though. So it was funny. Like, I'm not, that's what I try to tell people. People feel like you're trying to, you're pressuring people to do it. It's like, no, I live with somebody who told me, up front, I'm not doing it. She doesn't. And funny thing about it is that neither one of us routinely will take a flu vaccine. And there's research to say African Americans don't take the flu vaccine. Some people won't take it because they think it's going to make them sick. For me, I'm just like, I just never get the flu. I haven't had it since I was a kid. So I don't fool with it. I'm like, I'm not going to get the flu. So I don't worry about it. So, but she's more like no, I've gotten the flu. I've gotten the shot and then I got the flu. So, yeah, she was just like, you do what that's not my ministry. And so we just laugh about it. And that's what I try to tell people. If that's not your ministry to participate in the trial, don't do it. I mean, that is okay with me. I'm just sharing my story because we thought it was, if we're going to ask people to even consider this, we should be in it, not just tell people to, do as I say and not as I do. So that was how that came about.
Absolutely. Now, I know you've heard the concern, people who think of Tuskegee and the horrific history of trials and experiments for syphilis. You knew this going in, and you wrote this. You said, as presidents of historically Black colleges and universities, we do recall unethical examples of medical research in our country. We remember the Tuskegee syphilis study, which misused and caused harm to African Americans and other people of color, undermining trust in health providers and caretakers. What has the response been like, specifically with regard to the concerns that people might have with Tuskegee?
Yeah, I will always tell people, overwhelmingly, people are like, no, don't do it. They're just like, and I guess I was a little, I was surprised because I didn't really feel like it was a big deal. I was just sort of like, hey, it's something we should really be thinking about. But as people have raised concerns, I've sort of leaned into all of the studies that I'm seeing, and I share a lot of it on my social media, like, here's another study, here's somebody else saying. So
right.
There is more information out there saying this is why we should do it. The other part is that Tuskegee in particular has become a boogeyman for people because I read people who say they injected them with syphilis. That is not what happened. It's not true. So now it's taken on some myth that there was this, nefarious plot to inject them. What happened was bad, but what they did was not to treat the men. They just sort of studied the effects without the men knowing, even though penicillin had been developed as a remedy for syphilis, and they never gave them the cure. So it's very different from someone, you're agreeing to participate in a study and you sign consent forms and you go through all of that. That's different than somebody, studying you and you don't even know it. So to me, they're very different. But we use Tuskegee as an example because people have this history of, even dating back to slavery, this misuse of Black bodies for these studies that people didn't consent to. So this isn't like that because you have to consent. And when you go through the process, I've been twice because there are 2 injections. When I went back for my second injection earlier this week, the first question they ask you is, do you still want to participate? And they tell you over the course of the 2 years of the study, at any point in time, you can say, I'm tired of this. I'm not doing this anymore. And that's all you have to do. So it's, right. I mean, it's, That's been just interesting. So, I mean, I would say overwhelmingly people are just like, no, it's a bad idea. Don't do it. Don't suggest that people do it. And part of it is there is a fear of the unknown because the average person does not know anyone who has participated in a vaccine trial. I didn't know anyone. I mean,
Sure.
I've never had this conversation before. So it's a shock for somebody to say, wow, you're actually going to participate in this. And what if something goes wrong? And I'm like, man, there's so many things that we do that the example I use a lot is food. We eat so many things that we know that have been proven to be harmful to us over time. And we do that willfully, almost, gleefully. I live in New Orleans and I tease people sometimes and say my blood type is Popeye spicy. And I know it's not good, but I do it all the time. And
Right.
that Popeyes that I eat is much more unhealthy than this vaccine trial. And that's a fact. So.
You mentioned that you'll be involved in this study. I think I just heard you say 2 years. And I know you don't work for drug companies and you don't work for the government. But I guess one follow-up question would be, there are some assumptions being made that we're going to have a vaccine before the end of the year. What are your
Right.
thoughts on that?
Well, so they tell you that it could last up to 2 years if there is a vaccine that is developed, that is approved, and a study would end earlier. So they're just, because basically, I mean, I don't have any more injections. It's really just now the follow-up. It's because they want to make sure, in a year, all of your hair doesn't fall out if you, have get the vaccine. And the other part too is people don't understand is that it's a double-blind trial, which means half of the participants will get a portion of the vaccine. It's not a full vaccine; it's a portion of it, or elements of the vaccine, and then the other half get nothing. It's a placebo. So they're just studying people just who are just about doing their day-to-day business to compare the two groups. So that's your control group that you're studying, that you're just following them just like anybody else. And if they get the virus, just being out in the community, that's all. So you're not getting anything. And then one group gets a portion of the vaccine. So then that becomes a little bit different.
You are president of Dillard. Education is your playground, if you will. What is the teaching moment with this?
So I think the teaching moment really, at some point, because you hear just a lot of negative stuff. I just told my wife at one point, like, people just being stupid. I'm sick of this. I'm not worried about it anymore. And I'm just going on. But then part of me, and I think this is the part of me that's the Taurus and the stubborn part of me, is to keep pushing this as something that we should discuss because there is so much misinformation. And I've seen like 3 webinars now. There was a 2-part webinar that was really led by the HBCU medical schools. And I'm like learning so much about why the trials are important, how vaccines impact people differently. Because like the first night, someone asked a question, basically race is a social construct. So if people's bodies are generally the same, why do you have to have a test that includes African Americans if biologically everybody is the same? And so this professor from Columbia says that is true, but we have different lived experiences. So how we live and how we interact with each other and where we live are very different. So there are environmental factors that impact our body. So for example, like I said, African Americans have more comorbidities. Some of that is based on the nutrition that we're able to get. We have more people who live in food deserts. We have more people who live in, communities that have, toxic environmental conditions. So all of that impacts your body and how it functions. And so you might respond differently to a vaccine than someone who has a healthier diet, who lives in an area that doesn't have the same environmental problems with it. So when he said that, it's like, where you live and how you live, I was like, wow. So the selfish part of me is that if no one else learns anything about this, I'm learning a lot. So I'm thankful for an opportunity to sort of expand my knowledge. But I'm really pushing people to say, yeah, I understand people are concerned about it, but we should really have these conversations. The other teaching point is, I'm telling people that if you would rather have people who volunteer to participate in a study than for you to be experimented on. Because if a vaccine is created and you take a vaccine and you get sick because it doesn't work, that means they got to go back and figure out like, okay, so what do we do? Do we do another dose? Do we change this? So now you're volunteering for, an experiment, but it's a little bit more critical because obviously something went wrong. And so we don't have enough people who volunteer so that other people don't have to go through the pain of being experimented on. For example, when the actor Chadwick Boseman died, a lot of people started talking about prostate cancer, particularly as it increases in Black men. But one of the first things I heard, there are not enough Blacks in the oncology studies. So everybody mourns this 43-year-old actor who's at the height of his career who dies. And part of the reason he dies is that we don't have enough people volunteering so they could study it so he could be treated and not die. So it's a bigger question. So we got to start saying you don't need a lot of people, but you do want some people to volunteer. Because if you don't have those volunteers to make sure that the vaccine or the treatment works, then you're going to be experimented on when you're sick, no matter what the disease is. So I say we let people volunteer.
We are back with more. Our guest, Dr. Walter Kimbrough, president of Dillard University, in just a moment. But first, a word from our sponsor, the United Methodist Foundation of Louisiana. Your United Methodist Foundation stands ready to support the United Methodist Churches of the Louisiana Conference. They've been there through storms of the past, and they're here now for churches that need help. Hurricane Laura was one of the strongest hurricanes on record to ever strike Louisiana. If your church was in its path, you're buying supplies, paying for repairs, and meeting insurance deductibles. It's probably got your church budget cash strapped. Let the foundation help with a no-to-low interest deposit secured loan. No interest for the first 90 days, only 2% interest for 12 months after. The foundation is here to help, and that help is just a phone call away to some friendly folks who know your situation better than anyone. Visit their website today for more information, umf.org. Back now to the show and the topic of racial injustice in America. Dr. Kimbrough wrote back in June a great piece that we will include in the show notes of this episode. It was posted on Inside Higher Ed. He was reflecting on Bishop Bruce O. of the United Methodist Church, who said this: "We share collective responsibility to turn our thin words into thick action. We share collective responsibility to break our silence." Bishop O said this is the moment for the United Methodist Church and all peoples of faith to be bold in our witness against racism and white supremacy. Dr. Kimbrough concluded by saying this: "I have read some moving statements from my colleagues in response to the death of George Floyd. I have no criticism of those statements, but I want to profess a different truth."
So for me, it is that phrase, thin words to thick action, comes from a United Methodist bishop. And I thought it was powerful because we were in a moment where everybody put out a statement, all of corporate America, the NFL, you name it. And it's like, we've done this before. That everybody, it's almost like the whole thoughts and prayers. We give our thoughts and prayers after, 50 people are shot in Las Vegas, and then we go about our business. So it's like, how do we really start to think differently about addressing these issues? How do we engage each other differently? How do we just do the work of being, caring, Christians on a day-to-day basis instead of just saying, oh, isn't that too bad? I guess I could argue to a degree that me saying I'm going to participate in a vaccine trial as someone who has a sickle cell trait, because once again, they want to make sure that the vaccine works for people who have sickle cell anemia. I don't have the disease, but I have the trait. So having somebody like me in a study is actually a good thing. That's something that I can do. So it's not just me talking about, wow, this pandemic is bad. This is something that I'm doing that is tangible. I'm helping science, or as I, tease, folks that say I'm giving my body for science, whatever that's worth. But those are the kinds of things that we have to start doing. It's, how do we engage people differently? How do we put ourselves in different environments where we're getting to know people and interact differently and those kinds of things? Actually, just recently got asked to be a part of a commission that's looking at issues of free speech on college campuses. That's one of the things I've always, this, corona or this vaccine trial has been like a mini controversy for me. I'm much more known for the controversy of bringing conservatives to campus. I mean, it's like, no, you got to hear other people's points of view. I believe in that. It's like, I can't even, how do I argue with someone if I don't even fully understand what their point of view is? I'm just arguing based on my own ideology. So you sort of need to understand that. So this becomes, I think, a moment for a lot of people, not just to write some statement, which a lot of, higher education institutions have done historically, but it's like, go back again and look to say, what are we doing? What in any kind of area? How do we lean into that and do a better job, particularly along these issues of race? So one of the things, we're doing is, our board chair is saying, hey, let's do a center and talk about racial justice. And how do we work more closely with police in the city and address those issues? So that becomes more than just a statement. It's something that we're doing that's, we can track, we can have some benchmarks, we can have some accomplishments. Those are the kinds of things I think we can do as organizations, but individually, we can all do something different to engage people in our communities a little bit differently.
Speaking of the Center for Racial Justice that Dillard has established, it's described as this: Dillard is answering the call to be a conduit for change by engaging law enforcement officials, community leaders, and citizens to acquire the cultural competence needed to bring about systemic change to policing in communities of color. So much has been shared that something must change. And I think those conversations are often wrapped in protests, but the conversations about what needs to change, those conversations often take place in boring legislative committee rooms and take the form of policy, not protest, and are often maybe not nearly as newsworthy, but we know it's vital. When you think of what needs to change, what comes to your mind?
So actually, I was hearing this morning, I heard Mayor de Blasio of New York talk more about this idea of community policing. I don't think we've leaned into that enough. I think we got to go back to, you have a beat, the people in the neighborhood, as he said, people in the neighborhood have the police officers' cell phone numbers. They have real relationships. I remember as a kid growing up, you had Officer Friendly in the schools. My kids don't know anything about Officer Friendly. They've never seen that. I think we need Officer Friendly again. That's in the schools and developing relationships so that, students have a different impression of what police do. And police have a better relationship with young people, particularly in the high schools, I think is important. Because it's, as a kid growing up, I never view the police as someone that could potentially hurt me. Okay. My son is 11, and there was, I'm trying to think, someone died. It was some instance, and maybe somebody high profile died. And I think the first question that came out of his mouth was, well, did the police kill him? Well, that's at 11. I never would have thought that. I'm thinking Officer Friendly. Officer Friendly has your back. That's your buddy. My son is saying, well, did the police kill him? Because he's growing up in a time when he sees all these high profile situations of police killing Black men. So it's got to be community policing that we've got to figure out how to do that. There's studies, and we've talked about this on campus. There have been studies that say that police with more education, particularly like a liberal arts college education, that makes them better policing because there are other skills that they have to develop. They've got to really develop good people skills. I think a good background in psychology and sociology, because a lot of things that they're doing is they're having to address, issues of conflict. And those issues of conflict don't always need to be resolved with a use of force. That's why I think you have some of the defund the police movements to say, well, don't have the police trying to do that. You hire a different team that can do X, Y, and Z that can come in. And there might be a role for some of that. But I still think that having police that have some of those basic, really good soft skills, those people skills, there should be more emphasis on that, because I think we could resolve a lot of things very differently. Some of these high profile things that we're seeing, it's just a lack of those skills. They just don't know how to talk to people, engage, and they escalate to the use of force when that doesn't necessarily have to happen. So those are the kinds of things that we'll talk about, with our center, work with some people nationally. Hope we can deal with some of those issues in our city. We haven't had a lot of those kind of issues in New Orleans lately, but New Orleans has had some, particularly around Hurricane Katrina. But our former police chief, who is now in Baltimore, he did have sort of like, I don't know if I want to call it like a shadow group. So if he ever had an officer involved shooting with a civilian, there were some community leaders. I was one of the people on the short list that we would be called in to come look at the situation and then be able to sort of intervene. So some pastors, like I said, university president, some of those leaders. So I thought that he had a plan in place. So if we ever had that in New Orleans, he knew right away, I got my go-to group. I'm going to call them in. We can really look at it and figure out how to move forward. So I think those kind of creative ideas are what we need more of all across the country.
It's also not lost on me the number of prominent policymakers in this country who have a connection to historically Black colleges and universities, including Kamala Harris. What kind of role do HBCUs play in the formation of policy, something many say is what will lead to substantive change in this country?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I don't think as institutions as a whole we have played an oversized role in terms of policy. I think most people, those policies are generated from think tanks like Brookings Institution that write some of the policies, or bipartisan policy center in DC, which I've done work with them before. But we don't really have sort of like an HBCU backed or supported think tank to do some of that policy work. I think it's a great idea. Maybe that's something that will come out of this era, that someone, it might be a part of what we start doing and moves into something else to really help generate policy. That could be statewide level. And so you're giving me ideas now as we talk about it, that in terms of some of the policies that come out of the state of Louisiana, our Center for Racial Justice could offer, position papers and really work with legislators to really help with ideas for policy. So I think there's a role that we can play. The way we've seen it now is that some of our grads, and I think HBCU grads are disproportionately represented in the leadership at this time to address issues. So if you look at some of the major American cities where mayors have been wrestling with some of these issues, here in New Orleans, my hometown of Atlanta, in St. Paul, Minnesota, in Montgomery, Alabama, Birmingham, Alabama, Jackson, Mississippi, all of these mayors are HBCU graduates. So you're seeing that. And of course, like I said, you have, Kamala Harris as the vice presidential candidate. So, schools that educate 9% of, all African-American students right now, we're oversized role in terms of national political leadership right now. I think maybe 40% of the Congressional Black Caucus are HBCU grads. So once again, I use that to remind people, like, these schools have a role to play, and historically have had a role to play. When you think about the late John Lewis, and people who've died recently, C.T. Vivian, Joseph Lowry, all these are HBCU folks. Martin Luther King, HBCU, Jesse Jackson. So it's a different time. I mean, they didn't have as many options as to where to go to school, so they had to go to HBCUs. But now you're seeing people with many more options are still going to HBCUs, and a part of the culture of the institutions is pushing them to say they've gotten the confidence to say, I can lead no matter who the audience is, and we're seeing that.
President Kimbrough, final thoughts here from you. 2020, what do we make of everything that has happened in the year 2020 and everything that is happening now, and where do we go from here?
Right. So, I mean, I think, we've always talked about this idea of 2020 vision. And so I think part of what I have been thinking is that for us to really see, God had to slow everything down. And so I think we've seen a lot. The George Floyd situation is the prime example of that, because we had already been on lockdown for a couple months. We didn't have anything else to do. And we really got to watch that 8 minutes and 46 seconds, unlike any other, police involved death in the history of this country. And that created protests in every state all across the world for weeks, because people then had the time and the energy to really lean into that. And so the kinds of changes that we have seen because of that, are unprecedented. So 2020 in that regard helped us to sort of really slow down and really pay attention to what's going on, because you didn't have a choice. So, sometimes you can miss things and say, working on my vision, but if you're all over the place, you can't really see what's going on. We see clearly what's going on now. And so how do we move forward once we come out of this pandemic season to work differently? So I hope that there is lasting, changes in terms of how we operate, and not once we get out of the pandemic sometime next year, it's like, ooh, okay, let's go back to doing what we do. So, I think it's a very interesting time to live. It shows how resilient we are as people. We found new ways to do things, to engage each other, for churches, how you worship. So I just look at it as an interesting period of time, and things will be different after this. I think some things will go back to being the same as well. But I just, at some point you just decide, like, okay, let me lean into this moment. What am I supposed to be learning? What do I get out of this moment? And I think I had to, as a higher education person in a place like Dillard that is very much, relationship and driven, and everybody's really friendly, and we like to hug on each other. And this is New Orleans, people hug and kiss on each other. I know that's driving everybody crazy. So I think people are appreciating those relationships a little bit more. I've heard a lot of that from students when they had to go home early to say, man, I'm really, I'm fully understanding how valuable that experience is. So for a lot of people, I think we're valuing what we have a lot more because of that. So in many regards, I think this is healthy for us. I mean, it's got a lot of problems, don't get me wrong, the death and, the strain, the financial troubles, but there are going to be some benefits too. So we just have to lean into it and make the best out of it, and find new ways to work together, and try to become better people and create better societies.
Walter Kimbrough, president of Dillard University, we thank you so very much for carving time out of your very busy schedule to visit with us. Thanks again.
Yep, no problem. Thank you.
As we mentioned off the top of the show, Dr. Kimbrough named one of the 20 college presidents you should follow on social media. And well, now you know why. We thank him for his time and for his witness. We thank you for your time. If you've enjoyed this episode, we encourage you to share it with a friend, share it on your social media networks, and leave us a positive review if you have a moment. For our producer, Mary Burley, our sponsor, the United Methodist Foundation of Louisiana, I am your host, Todd Rossnagel. Thanks again for joining us, and until next time, remember the words of Dr. Kimbrough when he simply asked the question, what can I do to be helpful?